They denied her a sip of water under a sky that hadn't given rain in 43 days, and in a town where every drop meant life. That should have been the smallest cruelty, but it wasn't. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, stay with me, because this one rides in silence. The sun hung low but still burned like iron on skin, heat shimmering above the dusty street as Nayeli stepped through the saloon doors, her boots leaving faint prints in the powder-dry floor. Her lips cracked, her breathing slow but steady. She carried no weapon, no sign of threat, only a worn leather canteen at her side, empty. Elias Crow didn't look up at first, too busy polishing a glass that hadn't been clean in years, but someone near the bar noticed her shadow stretch across the wood, and the laughter started before a word was spoken. "We don't serve your kind," one man muttered, not loud, just enough. Crow followed his gaze then, eyes narrowing as if he'd found something unpleasant stuck to his floor. "Water's for paying folk," he said, voice flat, like he'd said it 100 times before. Nayeli didn't argue, didn't step closer. She simply stood there, dust clinging to the hem of her dress, the room smelling of sweat, whiskey, and old wood baked under 100-degree sun. Caleb Whitmore sat in the corner, chair tilted back against the wall, hat low, saying nothing, but watching everything. He saw the way her fingers brushed the empty canteen, not desperate, just certain, like she had already measured the outcome. Crow lifted a tin cup, filled it halfway from the barrel behind him, then paused, the room quieting just enough to hear the slow drip of water from the spout. He walked forward, stopped a few feet from her, and without a word, tipped the cup, letting the water spill into the dirt at her boots. It vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the floor. A few men chuckled. One leaned back and said, "There you go," like it was a joke worth remembering. The sheriff stood near the door, fingers hooked in his belt, eyes flicking between faces, but never landing long enough to matter. Nayeli looked down at the damp patch for a second, then back up, not at Crow, not at the men, but past them, as if she could already see beyond the walls of that room, beyond the town itself. Her voice came soft, almost lost in the heat. "You had water," she said, and that was all. No anger, no plea, just a statement that settled heavier than the dust in the air. Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, because he heard something in that tone most men didn't, something final, something that didn't ask for change. She turned then, slow, deliberate, and walked back out, into the burning light. The door creaked behind her, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then the noise returned, louder, rougher, as if to cover something they didn't want to feel. Outside, the wind had died completely, the kind of stillness that comes before something shifts, and somewhere beyond the last building, just out of sight, a horse lifted its head and went quiet. The heat did not break when she stepped outside. It held, heavy and unmoving, like the town itself was holding its breath. Nayeli walked past the hitching posts without looking back, her steps steady despite the long miles behind her, the empty canteen at her side knocking softly against her hip with each movement. A hollow sound. Caleb pushed his chair back a few seconds later, not fast, not slow, just enough to go unnoticed by most. But Sheriff Boone Carter saw it. He always saw movement when he was unsure what to do with it. "You thinking of following her?" the sheriff asked, voice low, like he did not want the question to belong to him. Caleb adjusted his hat, eyes still on the open doorway where sunlight cut a sharp line across the floor. "Just stretching my legs," he said, and stepped out into the glare. Outside, the street looked the same as it had an hour ago. Same dust, same warped wooden buildings, same horses tied in the shade. But something was off. The animals were quieter. One horse shifted and then stilled, ears pinned back as if listening to something too far away for men to hear. Nayeli had reached the edge of town by then, near the old well that had been dug 20 years back when the river first ran thin. She stopped there, just for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the worn wood frame, not pulling the rope, not testing the bucket, just touching it like a person greeting something familiar. Caleb slowed his pace as he approached, keeping distance. He noticed the ground around the well, cracked more than usual, the rope hanging still, not even swaying in the faint breeze that should have been there. "That well has not failed in 10 years, he said, not to her, not exactly, just into the space between them. Nayeli did not turn. Nothing fails, she replied softly, until it is asked to give. More than it was given. Caleb watched her profile, the calm in it. Not pride, not anger, something older, something settled. A boy ran past them then, kicking up dust, laughing about something small and unimportant. Life continuing the way it always had in a place that believed it would always continue. But then the boy slowed, looked toward the well, and frowned. It sounds different, he said to no one, before running off again. Caleb stepped closer, just enough to hear it too, a faint, hollow echo from below, not the deep, cool promise of water, but something thinner, something distant. He did not reach for the rope. Not yet. Instead he glanced back toward the saloon, where voices still rose and fell, unaware, careless. Nayeli finally lifted the canteen from her side, turned it upside down over the dry ground. Nothing came out. Not a single drop. She studied it for a second, then closed the cap and tied it back in place. You knew what they were doing, Caleb said quietly. Not accusing, just stating. Nayeli looked out past the town, toward the open land where the horizon blurred in the heat. They knew too, she answered. That is why they laughed. A long pause settled between them, the kind that stretches without breaking. Then she stepped away from the well and continued walking, not toward the road most travelers used, but toward the higher ground beyond the ridge. Caleb watched her go, something in his chest tightening in a way he did not like. Behind him, a shout broke the stillness, sharp and confused. The bucket is dry. Another voice followed, louder. That is not possible. Boots hit the ground in quick steps. Men gathering. Rope creaking as someone finally pulled. The sound that came back was wrong. Too light. Too empty. And for the first time that day, the town stopped laughing. The rope scraped again, louder this time. Rough fibers dragging against dry wood as two men pulled harder than before, expecting resistance, expecting weight. But the bucket came up too fast, swinging lightly as it broke the surface. Empty, a hollow thud echoing inside it as it knocked against the stone lining. And for a moment no one spoke, because silence has a way of settling heavier than any answer. Elias Crow stepped closer, wiping his hands on his vest like that might change what he was seeing. Lower it again, he said, sharper now, as if command could fill what was missing. The bucket dropped once more, disappearing into the darkness below, the rope unwinding with a dull rhythm, then stopping, then pulling again, slower this time, careful, as if caution might coax something back. But when it rose, it was the same, dry, empty, wrong. Sheriff Boone Carter shifted his weight, glancing around at the gathering faces. Men who had been loud an hour ago now standing with their mouths slightly open, trying to understand how something that had always been there could simply not be. Check the river, someone called out. Already moving, boots kicking up dust as three men ran toward the bend just past the last row of buildings. Caleb did not move. Not yet. His eyes stayed on the well, on the dark circle that no longer promised anything. He listened instead, to the change in the air, to the absence of sound where there should have been something, a breeze, a distant ripple, anything. And there was nothing, not even the usual hum of insects that clung to heat like this. A boy returned from the direction of the river, slower this time, not running, his face pale under the dust. It is low, he said, voice thin, lower than I have ever seen it. Another man followed behind him, shaking his head before he even reached the group. It is not moving, he added, like that part mattered more than the level, like still water was somehow worse than no water at all. Crow turned in a tight circle, searching for something to blame, something he could grab onto. It is the heat, he said finally, louder than necessary. Has to be. We have seen worse summers. But no one answered him, because even the oldest men there knew the river had never stopped. Not like that. Not in living memory. Caleb lifted his gaze then, toward the ridge beyond the well, where the land rose in a long, quiet line against the sky, and for a second, just a second, he thought he saw movement. Not fast, not obvious, just a shift in shape where nothing should have shifted. He narrowed his eyes, but the heat bent the air too much to be certain. Sheriff Boone stepped beside him, following his line of sight. You see something? He asked. Voice low again, like he was already afraid of the answer. Caleb did not reply right away, his hand resting loosely near his belt, not tense, just aware. Not yet. he said, which was not the same as no. Behind them, voices began to rise again, but differently now. Questions instead of jokes, worry instead of ease. What do we do? Someone asked, and it hung there, unanswered, because for the first time, the town did not have a simple answer. The well stood open, the rope slack, the bucket, resting useless at its side, and just beyond the edge of sight, on the high ground where the light met shadow, the shapes became clearer, one, then two, then more, still as stone, watching, waiting, and if you looked long enough, you could see they were not moving closer, not yet, which somehow made it worse. No one told the men on the ridge to move, and yet the moment you noticed them, you could not look away, shapes against the fading light, still as fence posts but too deliberate to be anything else. Sheriff Boone swallowed, adjusting his hat though the sun was already dipping low. "How many you count?" he asked without turning his head. Caleb did not answer right away. He let his eyes settle, let the heat waves thin just enough to see through them. "Enough," he said finally, and that word carried farther than numbers ever could. Behind them, the town had begun to shift into something unfamiliar. Doors opened, but no one stepped out fully. Voices stayed low. Even the usual clatter of tools and boots softened like the place itself did not want to be heard. Elias Crow forced a laugh from the well. "Too sharp. Too quick. They just watching," he said, like he needed it to be simple. "Indians do that, try to spook folk." But no one joined him this time, because there was something wrong with the way those figures stood. No weapons raised, no calls, no movement at all, just presence, and presence can weigh more than threat. Caleb stepped away from the well then, slow, deliberate, his boots pressing into the dust that had not shifted all afternoon. He moved toward the edge of town where Nayeli had walked earlier, his eyes tracing her path without looking for footprints, because some things leave marks you cannot see. Sheriff Boone hesitated, then followed a few steps behind, not out of courage, but because standing still had started to feel worse. "You think this is about her?" Boone asked, voice lower now, almost careful. Caleb glanced back once, just enough. "You saw what happened," he replied, which was not an answer, but it was enough. Boone looked toward the saloon, toward the men who had laughed, toward Crow still standing near the dry well like he could will it back to life. And for the first time, the sheriff looked uncertain in a way that did not hide behind his badge. The air cooled slightly as the sun dipped further, but it did not bring relief, only a different kind of tension, the kind that settles in your chest and does not leave. A woman stepped out onto her porch, holding a small tin cup, staring at it like it had betrayed her. She tipped it, watched the last inch of water slide along the metal, then stopped, like she was afraid to finish it, like there might not be more. Somewhere a child asked a question no one answered, and the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. Caleb reached the edge of town and stopped, looking out toward the ridge again. The figures were clearer now, more of them than before, or maybe just easier to see in the fading light, still not moving, still not coming closer, just waiting. He felt it then, not fear, not exactly, but recognition, like seeing a storm on the horizon and knowing it had already decided where it would go. Boone came up beside him, breathing a little heavier than the walk required. "They are not attacking," he said, as if saying it might make it safer. Caleb nodded once, eyes still fixed ahead. "They do not need to," he said quietly, and that was when Boone understood something he had not wanted to see, that this was not about force, not about taking, but about something already taken, something the town had given away without thinking. Behind them, the well rope creaked again, someone trying one more time, hoping the third pull might change what the first two had not, but the sound that came back was the same, hollow, empty, final. And up on the ridge, one of the figures shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to remind anyone watching that they were not statues, they were choosing to stand still. The first lantern was lit before the sun had fully disappeared, not because it was dark, but because no one wanted to wait for darkness to arrive on its own. Light spilled across the street in thin, uneven patches, catching dust that no longer moved. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if even the wind had chosen a side and decided to stay out of it. Caleb stood at the edge of town, unmoving, watching the ridge where the figures remained, and the longer he looked, the clearer it became that they were not gathering, not arriving. They had already been there longer than anyone in town had noticed. Sheriff Boone rubbed his jaw, eyes flicking between Caleb and the distant line of riders. "We can talk to them," he said, the words sounding uncertain even as he spoke them. Caleb did not turn. "You had your chance to talk," he replied, calm but final. Boone exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the well where a small crowd had formed. Quieter now, controlled in a way that did not come from discipline, but from something closer to unease. Elias Crow was there, still trying to hold his place in the center of things, his voice rising just enough to sound like leadership. "It will pass," he insisted. "The river runs low some seasons. That is all this is." But even as he said it, he did not look at the ridge, did not look at the empty bucket resting beside the well, as if avoiding both might make them less real. A woman stepped forward, clutching a small cloth around a jar that held barely an inch of water. "My boy is sick," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the words carried. "He needs water tonight." And that sentence did something the dry well had not. It shifted the room inside every person standing there, because it made the absence immediate, personal, not just a problem to solve tomorrow, but something that would be felt before the next sunrise. Crow hesitated, just for a second, then reached for the barrel behind him, tilting it. The sound that came out was a thin slosh, less than expected, less than safe. He set it down quickly, like the noise itself had revealed too much. Caleb turned slightly then, enough to see the exchange, to see the way people looked at each other now, measuring, calculating, not out of greed, but out of something quieter, more fragile. How long what they had would last. Boone stepped forward, raising his voice for the first time that day. "We will ration," he said, forcing steadiness into it. "Everyone will have enough." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the ridge again. Because he knew what everyone else was starting to understand, that whatever had changed was not something they controlled. Caleb finally moved. One step forward, then another, heading not toward the well, not toward the saloon, but toward the open land beyond the last fence post. Boone watched him go, then called out, "Where are you going?" Caleb did not stop, did not turn. "To ask the question you all should have asked earlier," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. The town fell quiet again as he walked, boots steady against the dry ground, each step taking him closer to the line between where the town ended and something else began. The ridge seemed farther than it had before, or maybe the space between had stretched, filled with everything that had not been said. Behind him, the lantern light flickered, weak, against the growing dark, and one by one, people turned their eyes away from each other and toward him, because whether they wanted to admit it or not, they knew the answer to their problem was no longer in the well. It was somewhere ahead, waiting, just as still as the figures watching from above. The distance between the town and the ridge felt longer with every step, not because the land had changed, but because the weight of what had been left behind was finally catching up. Caleb walked without hurry, boots pressing into the dry earth that gave nothing back, the kind of ground that remembered rain but no longer expected it. Behind him, the low murmur of the town faded until it became something softer, something almost like regret carried on still air. Ahead, the figures did not move to meet him, did not signal, did not shift formation. They remained exactly as they had been, a quiet line against the dimming sky, and that was what made it clear this was not a confrontation. It was a boundary, and he was the one crossing it. Halfway up the slope, the air cooled just enough to notice, not relief, just change, the kind that comes when day gives up its hold. Caleb slowed then, not from fear, but from recognition, because he could see her now, standing slightly ahead of the others, Nayeli, her silhouette steady against the horizon. The same posture she had held in the saloon, composed, certain, unchanged by anything the town had tried to make of her. He stopped a few yards away, not too close, not too far, the kind of distance that acknowledged both presence and respect. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them not empty, but full, like something waiting to be understood rather than said. Finally, Caleb removed his hat, not a gesture he offered easily. "They are afraid," he said, voice even, not pleading, just honest. Nayeli studied him, her gaze steady, not hard, not soft, just clear. "They were not afraid this afternoon," she replied, and there was no accusation in it. Only truth. Caleb nodded once, accepting that without defense. No, he said. They were not. Another pause settled, the kind that did not rush to fill itself. Below them, the faint glow of lanterns flickered against the darkening town, small and uncertain, like something trying to prove it still mattered. The well is dry, Caleb continued. The river is barely moving. Nayeli turned her eyes briefly toward the town, then back to him. Water does not disappear, she said quietly. It follows the path it is given. Caleb let that settle, because he understood what she meant, even if he wished it were not so simple. And the path changed, he said, more to himself than to her. Nayeli did not correct him, which told him enough. A breeze moved then, slight but real, carrying with it the faint scent of something cooler, something distant, not from the town, but from beyond, from where the land dipped and rose again into places most men there had never walked. Caleb glanced past her, noticing now what he had missed before, the horses behind the line of riders, calm, untouched by the tension below, their heads lowered near small patches of darker earth, places where something still lived, still held moisture. There is water here, he said, not a question. Nayeli inclined her head slightly. There has always been, she answered, and in that moment, the distance between what the town believed and what actually was became clear. It had never been about lack, only about choice. Caleb drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of that settle into something he could not ignore. They did not understand, he said, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that came close to asking. Nayeli looked at him, really looked now, measuring not his words, but what stood behind them. They did, she said softly. They chose not to. The truth of it did not rise, did not strike. It simply stayed, quiet and unmovable, like the ridge itself. Below, a lantern flickered out, then another, the darkness growing not from absence of light, but from something else entirely, and up on the ridge, no one moved, because nothing needed to be forced, not anymore. The night settled fully over the ridge, but it was not a dark that hid things, it revealed them. The town below now a scatter of weak lantern light and restless shadows, while up here, everything was clear, still, and unafraid. Caleb stood where he was, hat in hand, the silence between him and Nayeli stretching into something that no longer needed words to hold it together. Below, a voice carried faintly, someone calling for water again. Not loud this time, not demanding, just hoping, and hope sounded different when it knew it might not be answered. Caleb glanced back once, just enough to see the shape of the town, the place that had always believed it stood on its own, self-made, self-kept, and now looked smaller, like something that had forgotten where its strength came from. They will come up here, he said after a moment, not as a warning, but as something inevitable. Nayeli followed his gaze down the slope, watching the flicker of movement begin, a few figures stepping out from the cluster of buildings, hesitant at first, then more certain as they realized standing still would not change anything. They will, she said, her voice carrying no judgment, only acknowledgement. And what happens then? Caleb asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not be simple. Nayeli did not respond right away. Instead, she stepped slightly to the side, revealing more of what stood behind her. Not just riders, not just watchers, but something else, small patches of ground darker than the rest, places where the earth still held life, where grass bent slightly under the faintest hint of moisture, where the air itself felt different, cooler, quieter. Caleb saw it now clearly, not hidden, not guarded, just present. Nothing happens, Nayeli said finally. They will see what they refused to see before. The words settled without force, without weight, but they carried further than anything louder could have. Footsteps began to climb the slope below, uneven, cautious. Men who had spent their lives walking flat ground, now feeling every inch of distance as something earned. Sheriff Boone was among them, moving slower than the rest, his hat pulled low, not to shield from the sun this time, but from something else, something closer to understanding. Elias Crow followed too, though he tried to keep to the back, as if distance might separate him from what had already been done. The line of townspeople grew as they climbed, not a crowd, not united, but drawn by the same quiet need. The same realization that whatever had changed was not down there anymore. It was up here. Waiting, Caleb remained where he was. Not stepping forward, not stepping back, letting them approach. Letting them choose the distance they were willing to close. The riders behind Nayeli did not move, did not shift. Their stillness now less like a barrier and more like a mirror, reflecting what stood before them. The first of the townspeople reached the top, breath uneven, eyes searching, and then stopping, because what they saw was not what they had expected. No raised weapons, no anger, no demand, just land, quiet and alive in a way their own had stopped being. A man stepped forward, looking at the ground beneath his boots, then back at Nayeli, confusion and something deeper crossing his face. "There is water here," he said, as if saying it out loud might make it less true. Nayeli nodded once. "There always was," she replied, and the difference between knowing and choosing settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had come before. Below, the town waited. Above, the truth stood in plain sight, and no one could pretend not to see it anymore. No one reached for the water at first, even when they could see it, even when they could hear the faint, steady presence of it beneath the darker soil, because something in them understood that this was no longer about thirst alone. Sheriff Boone stepped forward, slower now, each step measured like he was crossing something invisible but real. His eyes moved from the ground to Nayeli, then back again, as if trying to understand where the right place to stand might be. Elias Crow lingered behind. The others, his usual certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something that did not speak as easily. A man near the front knelt down, pressing his fingers into the earth where the grass bent slightly. He paused, then lifted his hand. Damp, real, undeniable. A breath moved through the group. Not relief. Not yet. Just recognition. "Why?" someone asked. The word simple, but carrying everything they had not said before. Nayeli did not answer immediately. She let the question settle. Let it belong to the ones who asked it. Then she stepped forward just enough for her voice to reach them all. Calm, steady. "Because you chose who deserved water," she said, and the truth of it did not rise or fall. It stayed level, like the land beneath their feet. The man who had knelt looked down again, then back up, his expression shifting in a way that could not be hidden, not from her, not from anyone standing there. "We did not think," he said, and even as he spoke it, he knew it was not enough. Nayeli inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "You did," she replied. "You chose comfort over understanding." Sheriff Boone removed his hat then, holding it in both hands, his shoulders lowering in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. "What do we do now?" he asked, and this time the question was not for control, not for order, but for something closer to responsibility. Nayeli looked past them, toward the town below, the dim lights, the quiet streets, the place that had not changed in shape but had shifted in meaning. "You remember," she said softly, "and you choose differently when it matters." The words did not offer a solution, did not promise anything immediate, but they carried something else, something lasting. Caleb watched the exchange without stepping in, his place still, between both sides but belonging to neither. He saw the way the townspeople stood now, not in defiance, not in fear, but in something more difficult, something that required them to look at themselves without turning away. A woman moved forward then, the one who had spoken earlier about her child, her hand still holding the cloth-wrapped jar, nearly empty. She hesitated, then lowered herself carefully, filling it from the damp earth where the water gathered. She did not rush, did not take more than she needed. When she stood again, she looked at Nayeli, not with gratitude alone, but with understanding, and something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need words to exist. Behind her, others followed, slower, quieter, each movement measured, each choice visible. No one pushed, no one claimed more than another. And for the first time since the day had begun, the town moved not as a crowd, but as individuals aware of the space they shared. The riders remained still, watching, not guarding, not intervening, just present, as they had been from the beginning. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, feeling the change settle into something that would not fade with the night. Below, the lanterns flickered softer now, not from weakness, but from calm, and above, under a sky that had finally begun to cool. The silence no longer felt heavy, it felt earned. Morning came without birds, without wind, without the small sounds that usually told a town it had survived another night. The ridge still held its quiet, but something had shifted, not in the land, not in the sky, but in the people who now stood upon it. The townsfolk moved carefully, not because they were told to, but because they understood that every step now carried weight. The woman with the jar had already begun her way back down, holding it steady with both hands, not a drop. Wasted, others followed behind her, each carrying only what they needed, no more, no less. And for the first time, there was no rush, no pushing, no voices rising above another. Sheriff Boone remained near the top, his hat still in his hands, watching the line of his own people descend with a kind of silence he had never seen before, not the silence of fear, but of thought, of something settling deeper than words. Elias Crow stood a few steps behind him, not speaking, not moving, his eyes fixed on the ground where the damp earth still showed through, as if trying to measure something he could not name. Caleb lingered where he had been, neither joining the descent nor stepping closer to the riders, his place unchanged, but his understanding clearer. Nayeli turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the light of the rising sun touched the land beyond the ridge, the same land that had always been there, unchanged, waiting. She did not look back at the town immediately, because she did not need to. The choice had already been made, not by her, but by those who now carried it down with them. After a while, Sheriff Boone stepped closer to her, not with authority, not with questions, just with presence. "It will not be the same," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Nayeli nodded once. "It was never meant to be," she replied, her voice steady, not unkind, just certain. Boone looked down the slope, watching as the last of the townspeople disappeared back into the streets. Below, each one quieter than when they had climbed, each one carrying more than water. He placed his hat back on his head slowly, as if the gesture itself required thought now. "Thank you," he said after a pause, and it was not a word he had expected to say that morning. Nayeli regarded him for a moment, then shook her head slightly, not in refusal, but in correction. "Do not thank me," she said. "Remember." The word lingered, simple, but heavier than anything else that had been spoken since. The sun first rose the day before. Boone nodded, understanding that it was not a lesson he could set aside when the heat returned or when the well filled again. It was something that would remain. Caleb finally turned then, glancing once more at the ridge, at the riders who had not moved, who did not need to, and at Nayeli, who stood among them not as a leader, not as a judge, but as something else entirely, something the town had not recognized until it was too late to pretend otherwise. He adjusted his hat and began his walk back down, boots steady, each step carrying a quiet resolve. Behind him, the ridge remained as it had always been, still, patient, unchanged, and yet everything below it felt different as the town came back into view. There were no loud greetings, no hurried movements, just people going about their morning with a new kind of care. The well still stood in the center, empty for now, but no one rushed to it. No one treated it as something owed. The saloon doors opened, but no laughter followed, only quiet conversation, measured, thoughtful, and when the sun rose higher, casting its light across the same dusty street, it revealed a town that had not been broken, not been saved, but had been shown something it could no longer ignore. And in that stillness, in that absence of noise, something stronger than pride took root, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood.